before the group reached the village, they lost Sadir to her wounds. It was not the wound itself that caused her death. It was the fever and infection that spread through her. She was delirious and had walked off the edge of a ravine and fallen to her death. The group, Vell included, had done little to help her. It was a belief that only the weaker would die, leaving the tribe stronger as a result. Even so, Goblin medicine was rudimentary at best. Bryn had claimed her loot, giving Hulk a nasty knife cut along his arm during the disagreement over his claim to it. Vell groaned inwardly as Hulk tended and licked at the wound. Hulk was also one of the few goblins who could use a bow, not just carry one. And with winter arriving soon, hunters would be required. Hulk glared at the back of Bryn's head with a venomous look, and Vell shared the same sentiment. They could now hear the comforting and familiar sound of the waterfall through the dense plant life ahead, and their pace instinctually quickened as they approached their home. They had surprised the half-slumbering guard as the group burst into the clearing where the small village began. Empty and half-collapsed mud huts met them, overgrown and abandoned. It was a disheartening sight, but not an unexpected one. A stark reminder of all they had lost. It looked like a summer storm had blown through, and the damage to the huts and shelters that were not currently being used had been left for the forest to reclaim. As it became clear who they were, and that there was no attack coming, the village exploded with as much life as it was possible to display with so few numbers. They feasted and drank, half forgetting their dead kin as mates and birth mothers learned the fates of their partners or joined with the survivors. Bryn proclaimed himself chief, and after a short scuffle with another male who had been leading the tribe since their departure, a goblin called Gree, the tribe settled into nervous anticipation. After Bryn claimed the old chieftain's hut for himself, he set about appointing his supporters to his council, and eyeing any available females to see if he could add them to his existing mate. The chief's hut was the only one that would not have been looted while the party was gone, and was unsurprisingly in the best repair of any of the settlement structures. This was because it was the only structure not made originally by goblin hands. 3 stone walls had allowed the previous village chiefs to have their subjects build a comfortable, dry and impressively mismatched home and great hall. Vell had eaten with the village at the feast, but the noise and the closeness of it all had pressed in on him until he could no longer pretend to enjoy it. It got worse when Bryn confirmed him as a village huntmaster. The tribe had grown so small that they could all fit inside the chief's hall now, sit, dance and stagger about to pounding drums with only a moderate risk of kicking over someone else's fungus beer. Once the hall had overflowed with bodies and noise. Now it felt like a reminder of everything they had lost. He slipped out through the hide-draped doorway and let the cool night air wash over him. The roar of the waterfall greeted him immediately, drowning out the muffled shouts and laughter behind him. He walked towards it, drawn as he always was, and tilted his head back to follow the white cascade up to its source, high above the village. The sight steadied him. The moonlight caught the falling water and broke it into silver shards, making the whole curtain glimmer as if dusted with stars. On clearer nights like this, the waterfall seemed almost alive, glittering, restless, and impossibly bright against the dark stone of the cliff. The constant thunder of it filled the air and pressed gently against his chest, a deep, familiar rhythm that calmed him in a way nothing else could. He looked long at the glittering waterfall. It would almost sparkle in the darkest of nights, as behind the water's cascading face was a wide vein of metal. Polished by what must have been thousands of years of passing water, it reflected light like nothing else in Vell's experience, and resisted all attempts at mining the silver-blue metal ore. Not that they had the ability to forge any kind of metal, even if they had the tools better than rocks and sticks that the forest gave them. But the few pieces that the waterfall had given them were signs of power within the village. A large nugget of metal was mounted before the chief's throne, and every member of the tribe had placed their taloned hand on it before promising their loyalty to the chief. Vell walked the village, taking it in. Eventually he walked by the youngling pits and noted the new batch of goblins who played and fought there. Only 9 of them, with the matron Frauch still tending them despite the revelry in the hall. She was ensuring any fights did not go too far, as the younglings fought over the cooked rabbits that she had thrown into the pit. She looked up at Vell as he paused to study the whelps. Vell knew Frauch. She had been a lawkeeper when Vell was still in the pit himself. "What?" shot Frauch angrily, meeting Vell with her tired green and yellow eyes. She was tall for a goblin, with the small patch of black hair common to females tied into a series of braids around her head. On the Warparty's return, she had left the pit only briefly to find out if her mate had lived. He had, before taking the news with a snarl and a curse before returning to her work. Vell simply held his hands forward, with the palms of his grey-green-skinned hands facing her in a sign of wanting no quarrel. She huffed and nodded, returning her attention to the whelps. "Younglings ready?" he asked, crouching down and looking over the group below him. He doubted it, but there was little harm in checking before Bryn did the same, looking to begin training his new bodyguard to help seal his power base. In the true ways of the goblins, the younglings were little more than prospective recruits to a calling, and as the new hunt master, Vell had to ensure that the skills he possessed were passed on. "Too young," Frauch growled defensively, not looking at him. "Another cycle before the first is ready." She finished, glancing at him with a mixed expression of worry that only ever appeared on a birth mother's face, and that of disdain. "Too long," Vell muttered, and caught a venomous look from Frauch. He held his hands up again to signal truce. "We lose much. Winter comes." He looked from her and back to the whelps who were taking note of him now. At least the ones old enough were. 4 pairs of large round eyes regarded him curiously. The rest of the whelps were sleeping, fighting, or watching the fights that were happening on the far side of the pit. "Need hunters to feed village," Vell finished, looking at her and nodding in a way that showed he was leaving before standing and turning to go. "Come when moon's next full." Frauch's voice was behind him. "Gar near age, and have good eye," she finished. Vell turned to look at the pit matron. She was looking down at one of the ones that was still watching the 2 older goblins as they discussed his future. The whelp met Vell's eyes for a moment before glancing around the pit at his brothers and then back at Vell. The one she named as Gar looked slightly small for a goblin that was nearly old enough to leave the pits, but if the matron said he was ready, then Vell was not going to argue, and he simply nodded to her again before moving on. Goblins grew quickly. Within 3 cycles they were old enough to be taken by a master and trained. The tribe used to have a master hunter, master shaman, master warrior, master lawkeeper, matron master, and master crafter to ensure all the skills were passed on. Now, though, only the lawmaster and the matron, who was only master by virtue of being the oldest, were still around to do the teaching. Vell knew he would have to embrace the mantle of Hunt's master, even if he didn't feel it. Even though by tribal law a master could choose any they wished, they would be a fool to ignore the advice of a matron master who spent nearly every waking moment with the whelps. Even though by tribal law a master could choose any they wished, they would be a fool to ignore the matron master who spent nearly every waking moment with the whelps. Only a chief could lay claim over another master, and having seen the one named Gar, Vell was sure that Bryn would consider Guard too small to be of worth as a bodyguard or warrior. As a hunter, though, being a little small could be a major advantage when stalking or waiting in ambush. Vell moved on. He had recovered his sack of loot from the stash under the old log outside the village, and now needed to find a place to call his own. Staking his claim in the new village under Chieftain Bryn would not be a problem. His claim was small but important. As Huntsmaster, he would be answerable to the tribe should they go hungry, but that also meant that the tribe would praise him if he helped keep them well fed. That meant, of course, his status and belongings were far safer than most, as long as everything was going well. No one wanted to risk provoking the one responsible for finding their next meal. It could be just as dangerous walking around with a sack of loot that might have something of value within as it was to openly announce it. He had not won riches that would impress any females, and none of the females had shown prowess enough to impress him, if truth be told. The rest of those who had gone off to battle showed the normal lack of finesse when fighting, and only looted shiny things, gold and silver, or impressive-looking daggers and weapons. Those things never hurt, of course, but human weapons were normally too large for the usually meter-high goblins to use effectively, and they rarely made the wielder's life any easier for it. For Vell's part, he had liberated a flint and steel set from a patrol they had ambushed that one of his fellows had thrown away as unnecessary. A few pouches made of strong material that felt similar to spider silk, and a set of steel leather working knives were part of the gear that went with him wherever he went now, which he had liberated from the stores of a camp the warband had raided. A map had also come into his hands, but the mage had found out somehow and demanded it as tribute. Finally, he had something that was now his prized possession, a curious bow found among the wreckage, and had belonged to one of the mage's human lieutenants as the army broke and ran. The confusion had allowed those more pragmatic members of the army to loot the stores of the soon-to-be-dead mage, before running for their various homelands. Vell had taken the bow from the still warm fingers of the lieutenant. He had been wounded, and Vell had followed the blood trail to the man's tent and found him in a pool of the slowly spreading vitae. It was light enough for Vell to use, seemed to be made of some kind of ivory and dark wood he did not know. The draw weight was light, but on releasing the bowstring, the arrow would whip forward, with more force and speed than it deserved to. It could have been that the item was magical, or it could have been some trick of design, though that mattered little to the practical little goblin, and the only thoughts were of how it would help him feed the tribe, and himself, of course. He moved through the village with practiced stealth until he found the hut he would claim. To his relief, the hut had been abandoned like so many others, but looked to be in good repair. Not surprising, seeing as how it had belonged to Gwael, the previous huntsmaster. She had taken over it when the huntsmaster before her had died from wounds inflicted by a wild boar. She had built most of the hut as it now stood, using apprentice hunters as labour. Most goblin buildings showed little variation in their design, being round with low cone roofs of thatch that had enough slant for the rain to slide off, but were flat enough to have a chance of surviving one of the tropical storms that often uprooted trees that grew too tall. There was a small door that was usually covered with a thick and heavy animal hide to hold out the wind, and a few holes at chest level that served as windows to the structure, likewise covered with heavy pelts in the winter or during bad weather. A hole in the thatched roof allowed smoke from the small fire to escape, and the interior normally contained more than one sleeping area, a fire pit, a few crude shelves that would hold food or trophies while the goblin was in residence. If the owner was away from the village for too long, or if they could not enforce their claim, then it would not take much for a rival who thought the perceived vacant hut was better than their current one and moved in. This led to fights and feuds within the tribe that normally took the chief to settle. The Huntsmaster's hut was a large central structure with 6 smaller semicircles built into the main body, each one serving as a living space for the Huntsmaster and the full-fledged hunters. The Huntsmaster held normally a higher status than even the Master Warrior. Every goblin was a warrior, Every single one of them carried a spear and claimed a knife and perhaps a sling. Few, however, knew how to make and maintain a bow, set traps, or track prey that the tribe depended on. The huntsmaster's hut was where the young hunters learned how to make the traps they would use, how to preserve the meat of the animals they hunted, and, most importantly, how to use the bow. The huntsmaster's hut was the second largest in the village behind the chief's hall. It was one of the few that no other goblins could justify claiming while the huntsmaster was in residence. The only other structure of note was built into the side of the plateau next to the pool at the foot of the waterfall. A stone hut covered the entrance to the caves where the shamans worked their magics, learned their craft, and concocted potions of questionable use. Vell had never been inside, and was not about to start now. At present it sat empty and silent in the gloom of the forest. Vell often wondered if the constant sound of the water overhead was the reason the shamans had all been somewhat strange to downright insane. There was no one in the village who wanted to take up the mantle of shaman, despite the power it could bring, as more goblins failed in their task than succeeded. Only when a novice had shown some promise in interpreting the cave's many drawings would the village shaman begin teaching them. It was now especially dangerous, as without a surviving shaman to pass on the secrets, the only way for a goblin to begin down that path was to attempt to interpret the rituals and spells from the cave paintings that were said to cover the walls. Vell had no idea what lessons were painted there, but he could not imagine that a stone wall was a very good or forgiving teacher. Vell was the new huntsmaster. The new chief had confirmed it, and so it was up to him to organize the remaining hunters and begin training the next generation in the skills they would need. He stood before the huntsmaster's hut and remembered his own apprenticeship under Gwael, feeling his nostrils flare involuntarily. She had not been cruel, but she had been far from a kind teacher. Inside was where Vell had spent most of his childhood and a substantial part of his adult life, enduring Gwael's harsh training in one of the side rooms that served as a cramped miniature barracks for the apprentice hunters. Inside the main room was a larger fire pit, with crude cooking implements built around it, an iron spit for roasting meat or hanging a pot for boiling water for soups and stews. Stacked on one side were drying racks for drying meat and rough clay pots ready to store preserved foods for the winter. There had once been trinkets and small trophies from the apprentice hunters and from Gwael on rickety shelves and tied on string hanging from the thatched roof around the wall of the central chamber. They were gone now, probably decorating another hut in the village. To the left of the entrance was the huntsmaster's sleeping chamber. It too was empty, the bedrolls having been taken by Gwael on the campaign, and the few possessions she had left behind had been stolen without fear of revenge from the long-distant huntsmaster. To the right was a storage room, where extra equipment and traps would be kept for hunting trips, now empty. The main room was where the apprentice hunters would bed down around the fire and await their tasks from the huntsmaster or the other hunters. All these memories flashed through his mind as Vell looked around the main chamber. He checked the dark corners with his dark-adjusted goblin eyes and assessed how waterproof the roof might be, giving it a visual inspection in the grey-blue light of the moon and the flickering glow cast by the large fire that had been lit as part of the celebrations outside. He had not expected to find anyone here. It was one thing to loot an abandoned building, and very much another without earning the title of the rightful owner and risk a skilled hunter's wrath. Throwing his bedroll into the master's chamber once he was done with his inspection and stashing his loot for later in a particularly shaded corner under a pile of old pelts, he had set to work getting a fire going. It did not take him long, and by the light of the newly made flames he sorted through his meagre possessions in silence, ignoring the sounds from outside. The tribe was both celebrating their return and lamenting the loss of those who had not returned. He could not shake the faint feeling of helplessness and pointlessness to it all. With a stolen helmet that had once protected the head of a knight, unfortunate enough to fall from his mount among the goblin horde, now serving as his cooking pot. He heated some water from his water skin and threw the last of his trail rations, some dried snake bits and an onion, into it. He ate in silence, trying to plan for the next day and how the few hunters he had were going to feed the tribe through the winter.